If Janet Yellen's intention today was to prepare financial markets for higher, normalized interest rates, then she deserves a lot of credit. She was more hawkish than I would have thought. But on the other hand, there's still this business of now qualitative easing and a basket full of job indicators that, frankly, nobody's going to be able to decipher. Forward guidance? I don't know. I think it needs some rules or some anchor, not some vague, discretionary, and subjective decisions that will confuse, not clarify, and drive Wall Street crazy. Anyway, we're going to explore this here now with the answers. National Center for Policy Analysis fellow and former Dallas Fed president Robert McTeer joins us. Chief economist of the Heritage Foundation, Steve Moore, and our great pal, the NBC contributor, Rick Santelli. All right, Mr. McTeer, I begin with you as a former voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee. How did you read Yellen today?
Well, I didn't think she said all that much different than we'd heard from her before. The markets certainly read a lot more into it than I did, and they went down on something that they might have as well have gone up on. You know, that's if you say that you might normalize a little bit sooner than people thought, that means that the economy is improving. So the market should have applauded that.
You know, Rick Santelli, if I saw this quote from Leon Cooperman, I think it was via Dougie Cass, but Leon Cooperman says, if people don't believe or don't understand that interest rates have to go up, they shouldn't be in the stock market at all. I don't think a 1% interest rate is any big deal. In fact, the John Taylor rule thinks right now it should be 1.5. But I want to get your take. Was the impression that Janet Yellen was hawkish in your view?
No. Definitely not, Larry. I think what we saw today in action was some of the world's biggest bond funds and their positions being long threes, being long fives, kind of with a curve steepening bias, but they like to be long kind of the heart of the yield curve right around that 5-year sector. And if you look at threes or fives, they came out like a rocket ship with higher yields, lower prices. So I think that the market reaction tainted what followed with regard to why did the markets move. I didn't hear anything in the press conference. I didn't read anything in the statement that would have me in any way alter the timeline, and I think you nailed it. You said forward guidance is kind of vague, and the reason it's vague is because the notion of how exactly they're going to get us back from Mars to the Earth is kind of vague.
I know. I want to come back to this vague forward guidance, but Steve Moore, I think to some people on Wall Street, if it was a slip of the tongue or deliberate, Ms. Yellen said in response to a question, how soon will you raise interest rates after you finish getting rid of buying bonds after quantitative easing? And she kind of paused and hesitated, and then she said 6 months.
Right.
6 months, which means by the spring or the middle of next year. Okay. Now, I agree with Santelli. I agree with McTeer. That's no big deal. Do you think it's a big deal? Were you surprised?
I think it was a big deal, actually, because I've been really tough on Janet Yellen. I think you have a little bit, too, that she's been a dove. And I think I disagree a little bit with my friend Rick Santelli. I thought it was an important announcement today that maybe she's not going to be quite as dovish as we all thought she was going to. She talked about higher interest rates. She talked about continuing the tapering. That doesn't sound like someone who's going to be an inflation dove, and I applaud her for that. At this point, I want to err on the side of pulling back on all this money rather than too much.
So you don't agree with the market monitorists and others who want an easier policy. They want more money supply and so forth. You don't agree with that school of thought. Do you agree with that school of thought? You're kind of quasi-monetarist.
I agree with them that monetary policy has not been nearly as easy over these last few years as most people think. The money supply has really not been growing that rapidly.
M2.
And why is that?
Well, it's because banks have been holding excess reserves in very large quantities.
And why is that? No, I mean, this is
the key.
Yeah,
partly because they've been beat over the head and shoulders by the U.S. government, in part because loan demand is probably not what it should be.
All right, those are good. That could change, of course. Rick Santelli, I probably don't have this right, but I just made a couple of notes. Ms. Yellen was asked about these employment indicators. 6.5% unemployment is no longer the forward guidance for raising interest rates. So she said, okay, we will still look at the unemployment rate. We'll look at the broader marginal unemployment rate, U6. We'll look at the labor force participation rate. She talked about the duration of employment. Other people like Ed Lazier of Stanford think that she will also look at hours worked. In other words, Rick, if you look at like 6 things, how's anybody going to know what you want to do? There's no anchor here. There's no North Star here. This is my problem. Qualitative guidance, which is what we got, is kind of like how Janet Yellen wakes up in the morning.
Absolutely. Let's take both of those issues. First of all, I agree with you. Forward guidance. When I think forward guidance, I think of things like marshmallows. It's kind of spongy. It's not well focused. But when we're talking about all these unemployment metrics, I'm sorry, but you don't think they were looking at all of those things a year ago or 2 years ago? This is one of my biggest beefs with Ben Bernanke, the entire FOMC committee, and Janet Yellen. The fact that history has been changed in many ways by the dropping unemployment rate. The way it dropped under 8% right before the election. This has been big. The American people want things put in a simple piece of paper. They want things simple, and it's easy to understand. Unemployment goes down, that should be interpreted as good. People like myself have been out there for years saying it's not nearly as good as the advertised rate. Yeah. The Fed knows this, Ben knew this. But why is it only now they're talking about it? Because it happened to get to a threshold that they don't want to defend.
But Rick,
I'm sorry, I don't buy it. They should look at how many people are working.
Yeah, I mean, look, nobody believes that the unemployment rate is 6.7% today. I mean, there's nobody. The real unemployment rate.
I think the American voter believed it in November.
Oh, I don't know. I think if you ask
she did mention if you add marginal workers and people who have jobs they don't want, the so-called U6 unemployment, that's 12.5%.
Exactly, and
that's probably closer to the truth.
And then what Ed Lazier said in the Wall Street Journal the other day, that
hours worked,
and that's
falling.
like an increase in unemployment.
Right.
Well, the problem she had was she was stuck with this 6.5 number that we reached by having labor force participation change.
Exactly.
Not unemployment.
But the question I would ask, I'll ask everybody, but Rick Santelli, I'll go to you. You got some juice, Rick. I think you're on top of it tonight. Why should we target the unemployment rate for monetary policy?
Exactly.
Look, the Federal Reserve creates money. They produce money. The Fed doesn't produce jobs. Jobs come from tax incentives, regulatory burdens, overspending by the federal government, whether you're pro-business or not. The Fed can't just manufacture jobs. This is the problem I have. There's like this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. I don't buy it, Rick. I've never bought it.
No, I agree with you, and I think it's Congress's fault in part. They should take that dual mandate and chop it in half, A. But B, even more important to the issue here is that if in some indirect way they could do a cost-benefit analysis and say that in any significant way what they've done since the crisis is truly helped directly into the employment situation. But they haven't. They might as well target the orbit of Mars and say, until it gets X amount % closer to the Earth, we're going to keep doing quantitative easing. Because in my opinion, the correlations are about the same.
I would make the point that the fundamental problem with the American economy today is not monetary.
Right.
It's not. It's fiscal, it's debt, it's regulation, it's on the supply side.
It's certain presidents who are always lashing out against business.
Hyperventilation about what the Fed is going to do.
It's Obamacare.
Exactly. All those things are killing jobs.
It's taxing corporations.
And you're not going to be able to correct those problems like Obamacare, higher tax rates, by printing more money.
That's not a monetary issue.
Exactly.
He ought to just say that, Bob McTeer. Bob McTeer, what is... I don't know if the market reacts to this or not, but the idea that all these Fed governors, 13 out of 16 Fed governors, think the federal funds rate, the overnight target rate, will be 1% by the end of next year is a big deal. That's what they think. Is that a big deal? How can that be a big deal? If you normalize, it should be about 4%.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. It's just something new, part of Ben Bernanke's transparency that they've started doing that. But they're going to change their mind at every meeting based on incoming information. Right. Nobody's going to stick with where they put the dot a year ago.
So no one's going to know. No one up here is going to know. It's going to be the great guessing game. I mean, it'll be good for us, I guess.
We need rules. We need rules.
But we do need rules. We do. What's wrong with the John Taylor rule? What's wrong with the commodity price rule? I'll go to you, Rick Santelli. John Taylor rule says the Fed funds rate right now today should be 1.5%. And Taylor argues, and I talk to him all the time, he's a great man. He said, look, it's not an emergency anymore. The emergency was 5 years ago. Or other people, myself included, would like the Fed to keep one eye on a basket of commodities, including gold, or maybe stabilize the dollar. Now, I acknowledge there's no inflation. I acknowledge that right now. But Rick Santelli, why shouldn't the Fed have rules?
Listen, every aspect of our society and our economy has been hampered and definitely hurt because the rule-based society we once knew 8 to 10 years ago is gone.
Right.
Whether it's on the federal government and the regulation side, changing the rules affecting bondholders, some of the games going on with Freddie and Fannie paper, and especially the Fed. Can you imagine if we had a predictable rule like the Taylor rule? Investors can always know what's coming around the next bend. That's the way it should be. And once you move into the micromanagement and turn the Fed into a quasi-bureaucratic post office, it's going to be very hard to get back to any type of rule-based notion.
I would add, by the way, nominal GDP. I like that. Just keep an eye on that. That's what my monetarist friends believe in. But right now, it's like a lawless policy, Steve. Right. I'll give you the last word.
Not having rules creates uncertainty.
Yeah.
We know that markets hate risk and uncertainty, and that's what these Fed policies promote.
Let's move on. Thank you to Robert McTeer and Rick Santelli. We appreciate it. Steve Moore's going to be back a little later in the show.